Election integrity has been a hot topic in the US for the past 3 years. During the 2016 campaign season, candidate Trump threatened to dispute election results if he lost. Ever since his victory, there have been investigations into foreign meddling in the election process. They've turned up covert propaganda efforts, accusations about DNC hacks, and evidence that 21 states' election systems were targeted in cyber attacks. Today, we're going to focus on one aspect of all of this. What makes election security hard? At a glance, it doesn't seem like it should be. We secure sensitive information all the time. Without secure e-commerce, huge swatches of our modern economy wouldn't be possible. So why can't we handle a simple election? The key to the election security problem is a pair of competing requirements: anonymity and voter confidence. The first of these considerations is familiar to modern Americans. We vote in private, and many of us don't like to discuss who we vote for. If you know a little of the history, you know that this secrecy is intended to help the integrity of your vote, to prevent vote buying and coercion. The second requirement, voter confidence, is more foreign to us, which is why Trump's threat about disputing the election was shocking. To give a real-world example of why this requirement is important, Zimbabwe's 2018 election was followed by protests and riots during which several people were shot and killed by the military, all because of suspicions that the ruling party had rigged the election. So what these two requirements, anonymity and voter confidence, really mean is that the voter needs to be confident that their vote was counted without having any evidence to verify it for themselves or for anyone else. So how can a system contend with these two requirements? One simple solution, and the baseline for how we think about this, is a private paper voting system. A voter receives a printed ballot and a pencil, they step behind a curtain, mark their votes, and drop the ballot into a sealed box. When the polls close, the boxes are collected, and election officials, accompanied and observed by members of the parties, transport the sealed boxes to a central location. There, the boxes are unsealed, and the votes are counted in the presence of the candidates. As an aside, even though we think of this as the default system for our elections, it's not always how it was done. The history of this system in the US, especially the government-printed ballot and the privacy in voting, is a bloody, extended, sometimes racially charged brawl for power that spanned decades. The system bred from all of that conflict does a pretty good job. On a surface level, the security is fairly easy to understand. You fill out the paper that's counted, you see it go into the box, and the paper in the boxes are easy to understand. You walk away without a receipt, and you never see a record of how you voted. But the web of competing interests protects things from there. Someone from your party and the opposing party are watching every step, making sure the other doesn't try anything funny. Even the details of the system are worked out. In some places, pencils are favored over pens, in part to prevent smudging on the ballot paper, but also because of paranoia that the election pen might be filled with disappearing ink and left at a polling station that heavily favors one party. That sort of thing is the hidden genius of this system. It's really hard to do any effective meddling. Replacing a box of ballots would mean swapping out the box either without anyone noticing or with the consent of anyone who would notice, which means that fraud efforts are either difficult or dangerously large. And that's only for a single ballot box. In 2016, there were over 800 distinct polling locations just in the city of Philadelphia. Any conspiracy that could swing an election would require enormous, arguably impossible coordination. Of course, there are some flaws with the all-paper approach. Polling stations get crowded, ballots show up spoiled, counting is done by hand, and is laborious and error-prone. So what's the alternative? In the early 2000s, several states started adopting electronic voting machines. The systems they were replacing weren't all strictly pencil and paper. A lot of them were hole punch based, but there had been problems. Hanging chads, little machine errors that spoiled some ballots, and the infamously confusing butterfly ballot that may have swung the presidential race in Florida were still fresh in the public memory. The electronic voting machines weren't perfect. Some voters still had hiccups, but they felt like progress. And they solved some of the other issues of paper ballots. Counting was fast, ballots weren't spoiled. Immediately, though, alarms were raised about the new systems. By 2018, funding to remove electronic voting machines was included in the federal Secure Elections Act. So what are the concerns? What makes this system worse? Before we look at the voting system like the high-value target that it is, let's just consider it as a software system. My background is software engineering, so this is my immediate thought. Major software systems contain, on average, 15 to 50 errors per 1,000 lines of code. It's considered a fact in the industry that large systems have bugs. Some systems do far better than the average. The onboard control software for the space shuttle averaged a little more than 1 error per release, making its error rate roughly 1 per 400,000 lines of code. That may be the most extreme example possible. A team with one of the most mature development processes in the world, working on safety-critical software for a world-class engineering organization. Those aren't the circumstances for voting machine manufacturers. Not to say they're not making serious efforts, but the results are not sufficiently error-free. A 2008 New York Times article cataloged some failures of electronic voting machines in the previous year's elections. At the time, Michael Shamos, a Carnegie Mellon computer scientist who has done numerous professional examinations of state election systems, estimated that about 10% of electronic voting machines fail in some way each election cycle. These failures have minimal impact. He figures 0 or 1 vote per failure. But still, it's disquieting. That's the other problem that shows up for electronic voting before we get to anything malicious. People might distrust what they don't understand. Compare it to the paper voting system. You understand boxes, paper, and pencils. Pencil to paper, paper to box, box is opened, paper to tally. Simple. In electronic voting, you press a button and then wait for results. Most of the population can't conceptualize the middle steps except by analogy. Bugs aren't really deadly in and of themselves. E-commerce systems have bugs, but e-commerce systems have at least 2 parties watching each transaction, so the bugs are noticeable. The standard in-the-wild bug-finding strategy fails with electronic voting systems because of the anonymity requirement. Voters never get to see if their votes go awry. No one does. The systems are tested and examined, but there's no way to replicate the stress of Election Day. The hacker conference DEF CON has notably hosted a voting village the past few years, and the National Association of Secretaries of State noted that the village was, quote, a pseudo-environment which in no way replicates the state of election systems. The tests don't replicate the reality of how the system is used, and there is little to no visibility that would allow bugs to be found during use. So if a bug isn't caught in testing, it may not be caught at all. Next, let's consider what could go wrong when we introduce bad actors. Voting machines need to be programmed at some point before each election. People who have studied computer ethics are familiar with the trouble caused by software being easily copyable. It causes a different problem here, because copying a program onto a series of voting machines creates a single point of failure, that original program, that had no analog in the old paper model. To make matters worse, even checking for a problem is difficult. If a committee wants to look at the program, they have to know that they can trust whatever software they're using to examine it. The web of competing interests no longer works here either, because there's no way to see what's actually going on, or whether or not the correct software is being loaded onto the systems. These problems all repeat themselves when it comes time to count the digital votes. The New York Times article about e-voting failures I mentioned before opens with a description of a problem with the counting process. The article focuses on the counting server which crashed repeatedly. But the thing that caught my attention was the fact that election officials were apparently transporting the votes on memory cards. I would venture to guess that those were not supervised as effectively as a physical ballot box would be. Counting computers certainly are a potential target, and not a far-fetched one. Election officials aren't perfect cybersecurity experts. An investigation in Pennsylvania in 2011 found that one of the county's vote tallying machines was set up to be remotely accessible. There are some efforts to fix the problems with electronic voting. Ron Rivest, the guy who put the R in RSA, has taken an interest in the problem. His work suggests a system that would allow voters to keep an encoded version of their vote. By way of some fancy math, the encoded votes could be used to calculate a tally, but they could not be individually decoded. This means that individually verifiable information about the election could be publicly viewable without violating anonymity. Rivest is also a proponent of post-election audits, in which a subset of votes are counted manually, and then statistical modeling is used to see how likely the result of the full tally is. I'll link videos explaining these concepts in the description. Something you might notice about both of these improvements: they reintroduced paper. This was the more specific stipulation of the Safe Elections Act I mentioned before. It aimed to remove all paperless voting machines. Paper may remain important to our election security. There's one other branch of the digital election discussion I'd like to touch on for a moment: online voting. Given the problems we just discussed with paperless electronic voting, this might seem like an awful idea, but online systems have some properties that are worth considering. The first is that they spread out the risk. Sets of voting machines are programmed together, but personal computers are diverse. That doesn't mean they're secure, of course. A flaw in a major operating system could give access to personal devices of a huge number of citizens, for example. But the target becomes much more diffuse. In order to make a major impact, an attacker would need to compromise either a lot of individual systems or a hopefully better defended central system. The major weakness introduced by online voting is remote access. Most voting machine hacks, even wireless ones, require some type of physical access or proximity. The more systems are moved online, the more they're exposed to increasingly remote attacks. These risks are even more significant for central voting infrastructure. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. How can such a system even fulfill our requirements? There is actually one major functioning online voting system. It's in Estonia, alongside the traditional system, and it's used by about 30% of the population. We'll use that as a case study. The first requirement, anonymity, is almost trivial online, but its inverse, authentication, becomes an issue in a way that it wasn't in in-person cases. Estonia solves both of these by requiring the use of a standard, nationally issued ID card and a card reader. The identity data is scrubbed from the ballot before it gets to the National Election Commission. The clever bit here is how Estonia prevents vote buying and coercion. After all, before the secret ballot came to the US, votes were literally being sold for sandwiches and a beer. Estonians are allowed to send multiple ballots, and only the last one is counted. So in order to control someone's vote, you would have to watch them send it as the poll closes. This feature makes the scope of these conspiracies impossible again. There's nothing special built into Estonia's system to improve voter confidence, but some of Rivest's ideas, like the system with the encrypted receipts, could potentially work there. I should note that, as clever as it is, Estonia's system has been examined and security flaws have been found. Election security is a hard problem, and there's still plenty of work to be done on implementing good solutions.